Welcome to Defenders, the teaching class of Dr. William Lane Craig. Today, The Existence of God, Part 20. And for more information and resources, go to reasonablefaith.org.
We're looking at the moral argument for God's existence, and we saw last time that there is a difference between moral values and moral duties. Moral values have to do with what is good or bad, the moral worth of something. Moral duties have to do with what is right or wrong. It has to do with our obligations and our prohibitions. And then we also saw there's a difference between being objective and being subjective. Something is objective if it's independent of people's opinions, if it holds or is true independently of what anybody thinks, then it's objective. It's subjective if it's dependent upon people's opinions. And after illustrating this, then we now want to turn to an examination of premise 1 in the moral argument, which is, as you'll recall, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Let's talk first about moral values. Traditionally, moral values have thought to be anchored in God, who is the supreme good. Traditionally, God has been thought in theology as the greatest good or the highest good, or in Latin, the summum bonum. God is the summum bonum, the greatest or highest good. And then other goods are determined by how they relate to God as the anchor or the yardstick or the moral plumb line for value. But suppose God does not exist, then what is the basis for objective moral values? What plumb line or anchor remains in the absence of God for moral values? In particular, why think that human beings would have objective moral worth on an atheistic view? The most popular form of atheism is a philosophy called naturalism. Naturalism is the view that science and science alone determines what exists. What exists is what our best scientific theories of the world require. And if something is not required by our best scientific theories of the world, then that does not exist. But you see, this is devastating for ethics because moral values are not required by science. Science is morally neutral. You can't find moral values in a test tube. So it follows immediately from the perspective of naturalism that moral values don't really exist. They're just subjective illusions of human beings. So on naturalism, morality that we experience in our lives is really just a subjective illusion of human beings. Now, suppose the atheist isn't a hardcore naturalist. Suppose he's willing to go beyond the confines of science to see what exists. Still, we could ask, why, given atheism, are human beings objectively morally valuable? After all, what are human beings on an atheistic worldview? They're just accidental byproducts of nature which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, and which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why on atheism is he wrong when he says, and I quote, "There is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being." This is what, on an atheistic view, human beings are reduced to. So, what are moral values on an atheistic view? Well, it seems that moral values are just the spin-offs or the byproducts of socio-biological evolution. Just as in a troop of baboons, you will see self-sacrificial behavior exhibited by members of the troop. They will look out for each other's interests. because natural selection has determined that this is going to be valuable in the struggle for survival. And just as you see that in a troop of baboons, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, has similarly evolved a kind of herd morality which is useful in the perpetuation of our species. The illusion of morality has survival value and therefore is perpetuated among Homo sapiens. But there isn't anything about Homo sapiens to make you think that this morality is objectively true. It simply is conducive to the survival of our species. And to think that human beings are somehow morally special is to be guilty of the fallacy of speciesism, which is an unjustified bias in favor of one's own species. And so to think that human beings are morally special, different from other animals, is just to succumb to the natural temptation to speciesism. So, if there isn't any God, it's very difficult to see why the morality that has evolved among Homo sapiens on this planet is in any way objectively true. If you take God out of the picture, then all we seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on this planet who is beset with delusions of moral grandeur. He thinks that somehow he's the sink of objective moral values. Secondly, now, let's talk about moral duties. Traditionally, our moral duties were thought to spring from God's commandments. For example, the 10 Commandments. God has given certain moral commands to us which constitute our moral duties. But take away God, and what basis then remains for objective moral duties? On the atheistic view, human beings are just animals, and animals don't have obligations toward one another. When a lion, for example, kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra, right? The lion kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. Or when a great white shark forcibly copulates with a female shark, it forcibly copulates with her, but it doesn't rape her. Because you see, none of these things have any moral dimension to them. They are neither forbidden nor obligatory. There just are no moral duties to fulfill with regard to these things. Now, if God doesn't exist, why think then that we have any moral duties to fulfill? Who or what lays these moral obligations and prohibitions upon us? Where do they come from? It's hard to see that moral duties would be anything more than a kind of subjective illusion that's been ingrained into us by societal and parental conditioning. So, certain actions, say incest and rape, are not advantageous in human society. And so, in the course of societal evolution, rape and incest have become generally taboo among human cultures. So there are certain taboos that exist in human society. But this is not to say that these actions are objectively, morally wrong. Such actions go on all the time in the animal kingdom. Actions which look very much like rape and incest and murder happen all the time among animals. So, with respect to human beings, the child pedophile or rapist who tortures and kills a little girl on atheism doesn't really do anything morally wrong. It's just socially unacceptable. He's kind of like the man who belches loudly at the dinner table, violates rules of etiquette, or like the person who wears white socks with a tuxedo. It's just socially unconventional. But if there isn't any moral lawgiver, then there isn't any objective moral law which we're obligated to fulfill. So it seems to me that on atheism, there really aren't any objective moral values or duties, which is exactly premise one. Now, is there any comment or question that you would like to make about that defense of premise one?
All right. Anyway, what it amounts to is you said a minute ago that all these behaviors such as rape or incest you could probably see in the natural world, in the animal world, and therefore the atheists say, well, it's no big deal, the animal's doing it. But I think this is one thing that is not true. I don't think anywhere in the animal world they have homosexuality. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard someone say that one time. And have you ever heard about that?
I am not expert enough to make a biological pronouncement. Certainly there are animals that they're either sex. Certain kinds of animals, like worms and other types,
well, I'm talking
are
about mammals.
bisexual. And
I'm talking about mammals. Like you've never seen two male lions getting with it, so to speak, or
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I don't really think that happens in the mammalian world. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's one where their argument would fall apart, I think.
Well, all right, let me respond to that by saying that in the first place, as we'll see in a minute, most atheists want to affirm the objectivity of moral values. I think it's the brave minority who have the courage to face the implications of their worldview and draw these conclusions. But I think the vast majority, inconsistently I would say, want to affirm that certain things are really right or wrong or good and evil. And so they wouldn't try to read moral values out of the evolutionary process. Nature is red in tooth and claw. And if you tried to read your morality out of what evolution inculcates in animals to survive, then you would sanction all sorts of atrocities. So whether or not a certain type of behavior is observed among animals, I think is really morally irrelevant. Animals aren't moral agents, so what they do or don't do is just no guide to morality at all. It's morally neutral. So whether there are mammals that practice homosexual copulating is really just, I think, morally irrelevant because nobody's trying to read moral values out of nature. Okay, another question.
You said that the societal values have evolved to the point where they've determined it's beneficial for some of these acts to not further the society. Okay.
Yeah.
But so where do you come back to say that there is a God that has established, this is right and wrong? To me, the conversation typically just goes that, hey, that society is the one that determines or has determined that that's bad. That in no way means that there's a living God.
No, it doesn't. This is just the first premise of the argument. It will be in conjunction with the second premise that it will lead to God's existence. So just hang on to that question. As you're right, some of you may feel a little uncomfortable with what I've been arguing here because it sounds so much like the kind of atheistic or naturalistic propaganda that you read about in magazines and newspapers, namely there is no God and therefore everything is relative. Well, I think these folks are right. I think they are right. If there is no God, everything is relative and there are no objective moral values. And I admire those naturalists who have the courage to face up to this and own it. So I think that the writings of atheists like Richard Dawkins and philosophically Russell, Sartre, Nietzsche, and the rest are very helpful in understanding the human predicament apart from God. What would life be like if there were no God to anchor moral values and duties? And I think the picture is grim indeed. There was a question over here. Yes?
Well, even when they try to be honest with that, in the case of Dawkins, who said there's any moral obligation for the species to reproduce? Maybe if I'm the first human or the first gorilla, I like being the only human and gorilla. Who says I should propagate the species?
Exactly. Why think you have any obligation to perpetuate your species? Why not look out for self-interest? There, again, you can't read morality out of the evolutionary process because you have no obligation to do those things. So if you feel, for example, instinct pressuring you to engage in some self-sacrificial act for the sake of others, maybe even to sacrifice your life. Well, it seems to me on atheism that the intelligent thing to do would be to look out for your own self-interest, and there's just no reason that you should obey those instincts. Those are just ingrained into you by evolution and society. There is no objective reason to follow them, and so you ought to look out for self-interest and resist these instincts. So on atheism, what happens is there's a huge clash between what our moral conscience tells us to do and what prudence sometimes tells us to do. Prudence and morality are often at loggerheads. And the question for the atheist would be, well, why act morally rather than out of self-interest? Why not just act out of prudence? Some other comment or question? Yes.
So sorry, this is about 10 minutes too late, but I just wanted to I'm not trying to be rude to you, I'm sorry. But homosexuality is very, very common in the animal kingdom, and especially among higher primates. There are several species of monkeys that regularly engage in homosexual acts and even engage in heterosexual acts, with no purpose of procreation, just because it's fun. Mm-hmm. And it's more common among higher evolved animals.
Really?
So,
I've never
yes.
heard that. Do you have any kind of a
Bonobo
source or
monkeys.
anything that you could give us where you got that information?
School.
In biology
Yeah.
class or something?
So, but yeah.
All right. Thank you. That's news to me. Yeah, Joe.
Just a comment. I'm sorry for the aside, but dogs mount your leg too. I think they're just being stimulated. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's approval for. They also eat their young, so you're right. We shouldn't read out of the animal kingdom.
No.
Any
Right.
sort of moral. Could you? To most people, if you talk to a layperson on the street, they say something to the effect of, "Look, morals are just innate. They don't feel like they have to go any further in explication of this sort of thing. It's just somewhere in there, in us, somehow, whether we get together collectively and decide it or individually decide it, sort of a conventionalism or an individual relativism." The question I wanted you to comment on that, and also the question I had, could you turn this argument that you're just saying, look, it's hard to make sense of these moral things, these moral ideas on a naturalistic perspective. Could you turn it and say, well, wouldn't survival of the fittest or natural selection sort of encourage some predatorial behavior in some sense, what we consider to be traditionally immoral behavior, looking out for number one, rape or murder in the sense of the more powerful and getting the limited amount of goods and resources?
All right. That is what I said in response to Claire, Joe, where I said that if you try to read morality out of the evolutionary process, it will sanction all sorts of atrocities because nature, as I say, is red in tooth and claw. It is the predator who is preying upon the weak and the infirm. There is no compassion of that sort in nature, survival of the fittest. So nobody, not even naturalists, want to try to say that we should read morality out of the evolutionary process, because if you do, it will sanction murder, genocide, rape, all incest, cannibalism, killing innocent people. You can't try to read morality out of the evolutionary process. Now, with respect to a couple of the other alternatives that Joe mentioned, individual relativism, or he said maybe a kind of social contract that we get together and make a compact for the good of society. Those are both right in line here, Joe, with premise one, namely that objective moral values don't exist. Remember, objective means independent of human opinion. So relativistic views of morality and social contract views of morality are subjective. They are dependent upon pacts made by human beings. They're dependent upon human opinion. Had we chosen to make a different compact, then you could have a very different morality, such as in, say, Afrikaner South Africa, where blacks were disenfranchised, or in National Socialist Germany, where Jews and gypsies and homosexuals were regarded as fodder for the gas chambers in the oven. So those social contract views and personal choice views are right in line with premise one. Now, we will consider in a moment other points of views that try to defend objective morals without reference to God. But at least so far, I'm simply arguing that on a naturalistic view, human beings are just animals, and we have no grounds objectively for thinking that they're valuable or have any duties to one another or anything else. Any other question about the defense of premise 1 so far? Okay, now, if you share this argument with somebody else, I can almost guarantee the response that you're going to get. Somebody will say indignantly, "Are you saying that all atheists are bad people? How dare you say that atheists cannot be good people? That's arrogant and immoral. You're judgmental and intolerant in saying that about atheists." And we need to help these folks see that that is a complete misunderstanding of the argument. We are not arguing here that atheists are immoral people or that they can't live good and decent lives or anything of the sort. The question that we're facing here is not, do you have to believe in God in order to live a good and decent life? That is not the question. Do you have to believe in God in order to live a good and decent life? That is not the question. There's no reason to think that unbelievers cannot live what we would normally call a good and decent life. In fact, many of us come from families, don't we, where we have family members who are good, decent, loving people, but they may be unbelievers. So clearly, the claim is not that in order to live a decent life, you have to be a believer in God. Again, the question is not, can we recognize objective moral values without believing in God? We're not asking whether we can recognize objective moral values without believing in God. You don't have to believe in God in order to recognize that you ought to love your children rather than mutilate them and abuse them. Indeed, the Bible actually teaches that the moral law of God is written on all people's hearts, so that it says in Romans 2:14, even Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature what the law requires, because they show that the law is written on their hearts. So, from a Christian point of view, there is a kind of innate moral instinct or sense that all persons have in virtue of being God's creatures, and we don't need to believe in God in order to recognize that objective moral values and duties exist. Or again, the question is not, can we formulate an adequate system of ethics without believing in God? We're not asking, can we formulate an adequate system of ethics without believing in God? If a person is willing to grant that human beings have intrinsic moral value, given that presupposition, he can probably work out a system of ethics with which the Christian will very largely agree. The question is, however, why think that human beings have intrinsic moral worth? So the question that this argument is raising is simply this: if God does not exist, do objective moral values and duties exist? The question is not about the necessity of belief in God. The question is about the necessity of the existence of God. So we're not claiming belief in God is necessary for morality. We're claiming God is necessary for morality. And I have to say, I have been shocked at how even professional philosophers who ought to know better make this confusion. For example, several years ago, I participated in a debate on the subject, goodness without God is good enough, with the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz of the American Humanist Association at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. And I argued, as I have this morning, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And this is how Paul Kurtz responded. He completely missed the point. This is what he said, and I quote, "If God is essential, then how is it possible for the millions and millions of people who don't believe in God to nonetheless behave morally and ethically? On your view, they could not. And so God just is not essential. Many people, indeed millions of people, have been optimistic about life, have lived a full life, and find life exciting and significant. Yet they don't wring their hands about whether or not there is an afterlife. It's living here and now that counts." End quote. Now, Kurtz's point only shows that belief in God is not necessary for living an optimistic and full life. It doesn't do anything to respond to my claim that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. So, to repeat, again, just to make it absolutely clear, belief in God is not necessary for morality. God is necessary for morality. That's the argument. Any question or response to that clarification of a very common confusion? Yes, Steve.
So actually, if God does not exist, there is no bad or good objectively.
Right.
Therefore, now other people, even atheists, can subjectively believe they know objective moral values, but they're by definition subjective. In fact, you would have to absolutely know God completely to know if you know any objective. Everything is subjective until you know Him.
Well, no. Now look, if God exists, then there is objective morality. And that means, for example, that the atheist is doing wrong things when he commits sins that are against God's will. The atheist is doing good things when he does things that are in accordance with God's will. And that is the case even if the atheist doesn't believe in God. So again, belief in God is not necessary for objective morality. The atheist can do evil and can do good if God exists, even though the atheist doesn't believe in God. So don't think that because he doesn't believe in God, everything becomes subjective. What matters is that God exists, not whether the atheist believes in Him. Go ahead.
No, what I was saying is you can't know that what you subjectively know is actually objectively true until you know the Creator, because it all comes from Him. People can obey. In fact, it's written on everybody's heart.
Right.
For the large part, most people, all atheists included, believe that in the bulk and try to obey the bulk of the objective laws because they're essential for self-preservation.
Yeah.
A lot of them.
Well,
I was just saying that's a more of a knowing whether you can actually know God.
Yeah. In taking this stand on this argument, Steve, I'm not committing myself to how we come to know about objective moral values. I'm inclined to think that the atheist can know that objective moral values exist because I believe Romans 2:14 and 15 says that it's written on the hearts of all men. And so when the atheist sees that loving his children is a good thing to do, I think that he has moral knowledge. He has knowledge of that truth, but he just doesn't understand the foundation for it. So that is neither here nor there with regard to my argument. Certainly some moral duties we wouldn't be able to apprehend without a knowledge of God, because certain commandments that God gives us would be things that we might not be able to read off of the sort of natural law. Sunday or Sabbath worship, for example, would not be something that you could read off of the natural law, the natural moral law, but that's a commandment God has given. So you wouldn't be able to know about that moral duty to keep the Sabbath unless you had some revelation from God. So there could be a variety of ways that we can come to moral knowledge. Some could be through the instinct of written on our hearts. Some could be through intuition. Some could be through divine revelation. And I'm not making a commitment on any of those. All right. Yes, Jim?
But I'm assuming from the atheist argument standpoint, they wouldn't agree with you that the fact that they naturally love their children is anything other than a subjective decision, would they? In other words, where they say millions of atheists live good lives, wouldn't they argue those are millions of individual subjective decisions that result in a similar outcome?
This is the paradox, Jim. The fact is, and I'll say something about this when we get to premise 2, the majority of philosophers who are atheists believe in objective moral values. They do affirm the objectivity of moral values and moral duties. There are not that many philosophers that I've run into who are willing to take the kind of nihilistic line, which says that there are no moral values, or there is no moral knowledge. Most of them really do believe in objective morality. And I'll say something more about that when we get to the second premise. So it's a misimpression, actually, that these intellectuals are all relativists. Actually, they're not. That's more in pop culture than among these academics. Joe? Oh, I'm sorry.
I'll wait to the next premise.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I'm getting ahead of myself.
All right, well, we'll have Joe then.
Dr. Craig, you've debated a lot of people. Do you find the contemporary atheist is as honest about the moral situation as, say, a Nietzsche or a Russell?
No, I don't, Joe. I don't think they can face the conclusions. I have great admiration for somebody like Nietzsche, even though he was in many ways a very pathetic and unhappy man. Nevertheless, Nietzsche had the courage to face the death of God that he proclaimed and to draw unflinchingly the implications from the death of God, namely the nihilism that results from atheism. Now, it's interesting, Joe, in his personal life, Nietzsche couldn't live like that. You can show in his personal life that he couldn't live as though moral values were purely subjective. Shortly before he went insane and was had to be institutionalized, he was in, I think it was Torino, Italy, and there was a man mercilessly beating his horse, trying to get it to move this wagon. And Nietzsche, in tears, threw himself around the neck of the horse to try to protect it from the blows of this cruel master who was beating it. Even Nietzsche, the so-called, person who was the Übermensch, declared living beyond good and evil, couldn't live that way. But at least intellectually he understood the consequences of the death of God that he proclaimed. Any other comment or question on this point? We'll go back to Steve then.
I guess what I was getting at is your objective moral values depends on the God.
Right.
And by definition, there can only be objective moral values if there is a God, unless they're changing what objective means or something like that.
That's right. You've got to watch out for the terminology, folks. Boy, that is really true, Steve. What will happen is they will affirm objective moral values, but they will quietly change the definition of objective. For example, they will say now that objective, that values that are the product of evolution and of the societal conditioning are objective in the sense that they're not just sort of made up. They're not just made up by people in the way that we have made up rules that in America we drive on the right-hand side of the road, whereas in Great Britain they drive on the left-hand side. Moral values aren't like that. They'll say they have an objective reality or foundation in that they are the product of evolution rather than inventions of human beings. And so they've changed the meaning of objective in that sense. Certainly they're objective in the sense that they can be the products of evolution, but they're not objective in the sense that they're valid and binding, independent of human opinion. You still have to, by choice, say, well, I'm going to agree that those things that have been instilled into us by evolution are valid and binding. And if you care not to make that decision, then there's nothing wrong with that. There's no moral obligation to agree with those things. So you've got to be very careful how the definition works here. All right, any other comment on this misunderstanding of the argument that frequently occurs? Well, there's one other response that you can be sure to get when you present this argument, and this is the so-called Euthyphro dilemma. The Euthyphro dilemma is named after a character in one of Plato's dialogues called Euthyphro. And the argument or the dilemma basically goes like this. Is something good because God wills it? Or does God will it because it's good? Is something good just because God wills it? Or does God will it because it is good? And the claim is that either one of those horns of that dilemma have unacceptable consequences. If you say that something is good just because God wills it, then that makes morality arbitrary. It means God could have willed that it be good that we hate one another and kill and murder each other, that greed and rapacity and selfishness be good, and it would be actually evil and sinful to love another person and be compassionate. And that seems crazy. So you can't just say that because God wills something, that makes it good. On the other hand, if you say, well, no, God wills something because it is good, then that means that the good is independent of God. Now it means that God himself has to look to some higher standard, and what he wills and commands will be in accord with that higher standard. And therefore, morality is not based upon God. After all, morality is independent of God. Indeed, in a sense, God himself is subservient to the good. He himself has to make his life conform to the good, and he has to fulfill his moral obligations and duties to the good, so that moral values and duties, in fact, do exist independently of God, and that contradicts premise 1. Now, is there any comment or question about that dilemma before we say something by way of response to it? All right. Well, I don't think that we need, in fact, to refute either horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, because the dilemma is a false dilemma. That is to say, these aren't the only two choices. There's a third alternative, and that is God wills something because he is good. God wills something because he is good. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that God's own nature is the standard of goodness, and his commands to us are necessary expressions of his own moral character. So, in short, our moral duties are determined by the commandments of a just and loving God. Our moral duties are determined by the commandments of a just and loving God. So, moral values are not independent of God because God's own character defines what is good. God is essentially compassionate, loving, kind, just, impartial, fair, and so on. And so his moral nature is the defining standard of what is good. Now, God's commands then reflect his essential nature. They flow necessarily out of his nature, and therefore they're not arbitrary. So, if the atheist asks you, for example, well, if God commanded that we should all murder our children, would we be morally obligated to murder our children? That question is like asking, if there were a square circle, would its area be computed by squaring its sides? You see, it's a meaningless question because the antecedent of the question is logically impossible. There is no such thing as a square circle. So there's no answer to the question whether the area of a square circle is computed by squaring one of the sides. In exactly the same way, to say, well, if God were to command that everybody commit child abuse, would we be obligated is to posit something like a square circle. It's a logical incoherence. So, the Euthyphro dilemma is a false dilemma. It presents us with a false choice, and you shouldn't be fooled by it. The morally good or bad is determined by God's nature. The morally right or wrong is determined by his commandments or his will. So his nature determines the good and the bad. His will determines the right and the wrong. God wills something because he is good, and something is right because God wills it. God wills something because he is good, and something is right because God wills it. Now, this view of morality has been defended in our day by very prominent ethicists like Robert Adams, Philip Quinn, William Alston, and so on. And yet, atheists still go on pressing the straw man erected by this Euthyphro dilemma as though it had never been answered. For example, in the recent Cambridge Companion to Atheism, published in 2007, there's an article on God and morality written by a very prominent ethicist. And in this article, he refers neither to the work of any of these men, nor to the view of ethics that I've been explaining this morning, but instead the only view that he presents as a theistic-based ethics is the view that God just arbitrarily made up moral values. God just made them up. And that is a straw man which nobody I know defends. So the Euthyphro dilemma is very, very common in the literature. It's commonly pressed, but in fact, it's a false dilemma, and you shouldn't be misled by it. Again, the answer, I think, to the Euthyphro dilemma is neither to say that that something is good because God wills it, or that God wills something because it is good. The answer is to say that God wills something because he is good. Any final question or comment on that before we close? Yeah, Ben.
You said, you're saying, would our moral obligation change if, God all of a sudden said murder our children or anything, but that couldn't happen because it would be self-contradictory or whatever. What about cases like when God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac? Like if that would have been wrong, would have been murder had God not instructed it, but then because he did, or if Hosea marrying the harlot, things like that, if he has a higher purpose for it, things that would have been wrong are no longer wrong if they're directly instructed, or does the fact that he never actually sacrificed Isaac maybe make this whole point null in the first place?
No, I would say the former. I think that God is able to make exceptions to certain moral commands that he gives in general, so that, for example, he can command Abraham to do an act which, had Abraham undertaken it on his own initiative, would have been wrong. It would have been sin. But given the presence of a divine command, it now becomes Abraham's duty to do it. But what I'm suggesting is it would be contrary for God to God's moral nature for there to be a sort of general command that child abuse is good, that this is the way we should behave, and that loving your children is evil. That's what I'm suggesting would be contrary to his nature. But there could be these exceptional cases where God, who is the source of the moral law, can make an exception and command a person to do something which in the absence of a divine command would have been wrong, but is in fact now his moral duty. That's worth talking about some more, and so I hope maybe next time we can continue that discussion. So we'll break it off there and then come back next time and look at the argument for atheistic moral Platonism, another type of response to premise 1.
The copyright for the content of this recording is held by Dr. William Lane Craig. For more, go to reasonablefaith.org.